Good afternoon, and welcome to CREST February webinar. We're celebrating Black History Month, and today's topic is moving from transgenerational trauma to transgenerational resilience, helping Black children heal from historical racism. Thank you all for checking in with us and joining us today. As you know, we begin with a shout out. So if you could, in the chat, could you just say hello and tell us where you are logging in from? So we want to know, where are you from? We want to know who's here. We want to welcome you. And we also want everybody to see that we come from a lot of different places joining us today. So if you could just do a little shout out in the chat and say hello and where are you hailing from? I can see them coming in now. Thank you, thank you. Oh, I love being represented by Louisiana, right? But we also got folks from all over, North Carolina, Illinois, Florida. I'm loving it, loving it, loving it. I saw that some folks, and of course, New Orleans here, Tennessee, lovely. Thank you, thank you. Keep it going, keep it going. We want to know who is here, who is joining us as part of that. As we continue that, I will let Dr. West, one of our co-founders, to start us off by introducing the CREST team, and then she'll move on to the panelists. Absolutely.
Are we sharing the slides?
Absolutely. I'll pull that up very shortly. Thank you so much for that reminder. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
For those of you who have been with us on with some of our previous webinars, I'm sure you're very familiar with Dr. West Olatunji and I, who serve as co-founders of the CREST Achieve program. You have already probably heard our bios before. They are available on our website. So I'm going to move on to the panelists that we have today. I am very delighted to introduce you to three of our panelists, as well as our staff members. I'm sorry, Dr. West Olatunji. You can go back to our staff members.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, there you go.
Okay, so today, serving as the moderator of the of this webinar with our panelists is Ms. Ashley Petion, who is our graduate research assistant, our senior graduate research assistant, who's a doctoral student at Georgia State University. And she has been with us the longest and has been doing such a fantastic job and is helping us to train some of our newer members, including our newest team member, Ms. Jacqueline Marshall, who is a graduate student at Barry University in Florida, Miami, Florida. We also have as members of our team, our social media individuals. So the first of which, if Dr. Westall, if you could advance the slide.
Yes, of course.
Our original social media intern was Ms. Janae Bond, who has been promoted to our graphic designer and has been doing a great job working on our websites and helping us design promotional materials, along with our new or current social media intern, Ms. Taya Dickerson. I'm going to share with you some updates. So we generally talk about our plan. So the first thing that I'd like to share with you is our upcoming event. So next month, on the 15th, we'll be having a webinar entitled Dispelling the Myth of the Sassy Black Girl. And we will address some of the stereotypes about Black girls and adolescents and even women and how that impacts their development. Upcoming next month as well will be the March edition of Uplift, which is our newsletter. Hopefully all of you are already subscribed to the newsletter. If you haven't, please feel free to go to our website at crestprogram.com and subscribe to our newsletter. It is upcoming. We'll be producing that in March. Also this month will be a communique on Black History Month, which will share information about our events as well as other events in honor of Black History Month. In terms of concept papers, I've already shared that the 3 panelists today have generated concept papers, 2 of which are already on our website under resources. The final one will also be added soon. For those of you who might have attended our previous training on African-centered counseling, that is available to access on our Thinkific website, and we'll share that link. The other thing that we want to let you know about is this month, between February 16th and 19th in New Orleans, speaking of the New Orleans crew, we will have a booth in the exhibit hall at the ESEA conference, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act conference in New Orleans. And this is our first time as part of this particular program being a part of the exhibit hall. And we have lots of materials that we'll be sharing, as well as giveaways. And if you can't attend in person, you can always register for the conference and attend virtually and be able to access some great information that will be relevant to the work that you do or to you in your own personal lives. And then finally, we want to share with you our spring calendar of events. We have already planned out the webinars or training events that we have scheduled for the first 5 months of this year, so through May. And of course, those of you who have already signed up, there have been people who have signed up for our May event already. But as I discussed, March is about dispelling the myth of the sassy Black girl. In April, we'll be talking about parenting skills, 5 skills in particular that correlate to high academic achievement in Black children. And in May, in honor of National Mental Health Month, as well as Mother's Day, we'll be hosting a training on how to address the mental health needs of Black mothers.
Thank you. And now we'll turn over the session to Ashley, who will also be our moderator. And so off to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Dr. West, and Dr. West. So we are really excited to host this conversation and have you all be a part of it. We wanted to share some things that we hope that you gain from this dialogue today. The first thing is that we hope that you increase your knowledge about transgenerational trauma and as it impacts Black children and Black children in schools. We also hope that through today's dialogue, you're able to augment your awareness of the impact of educational hegemony in education and mental health training programs that limit professionals' ability to counter the race-based stress that Black youth experience within schools and even within their families. And then lastly, we hope that you will expand your understanding of the use of culture-centered interventions for Black school children, which is really what the CREST program is all about. So through these things and these learning objectives and the questions that we're going to be asking the panelists today, we hope that you are able to increase knowledge and skills and all those sorts of things as they relate to Black children and transgenerational trauma. I did want to also invite you all to share questions and interact via the chat. So if something resonates with you, or if you have a comment that you'd like to add, please share that in the chat, and you can send that directly to us, like the host and the panelists, or you can share it with the entire audience. So it should say everyone above your chat. And you can share that with us. The other thing is we are going to try and hold space for a question and answer at the end. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be like a panel of multiple different options, and you'll see a Q&A feature. You can click on that and pose a new question to the panelists, and we will work through those. You might have one of the co-founders kind of address it via like typing the response, or we might answer it live and then pose the question to the panelists and have them answer that live. So we really want for this to be interactive. That is some of the feedback that we've gotten from previous webinars and events, is that you all really enjoy being able to interact with the speakers and that sort of thing. So we encourage you to take advantage of that. And I look forward to incorporating some of the questions that you all might have for our panelists. So with that being said, I think we can go ahead and jump right into the questions for the panelists. So I don't know if we wanted to stop the screen share so that we can see our faces are bigger.
We did want to just lift up the panelists. We haven't introduced them yet. So if you could just quickly just provide their names, and we can send people to the website for the bios, I suppose, but we could at least do that.
Okay, sure thing. So I see that Jacqueline has put the link to our website there. And as previously stated, each of our panelists have been commissioned to construct concept papers for our website. So I encourage you to check those out. There's also accompanying interviews that I conducted with each of them as well. So we'll share a little bit about each of them individually and then jump into the group conversation. So today with us, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Melanie Acosta. She is an assistant professor of education at Florida Atlantic University, and her research is focused on supporting African-American educational excellence through improved teaching and school supports, particularly relating to elementary literacy in classrooms and local communities. So we also, as Dr. Wessel stated, we also have their bios on our website. So if you want to read more about them and their papers, we encourage you to share that there. We also have Dr. Samuel Berbings IV with us, and he is a multidisciplinary African-centered education scholar, and his research focuses on examining the causal genetic mechanisms of underpinning learning preferences and affective disorders brought about by environmental stressors among people of African descent. He has been the lead and co-author of several scholarly journal articles presented at national and international conferences, and we are super excited to have Dr. Berbings with us today. And then we've also got Dr. Caldwell. He is an assistant professor at Xavier University in the Division of Education and Counseling. He is a proud graduate of Florida A&M University. I saw we have someone from Tallahassee in the chat. I'm also born and raised in Tallahassee. He also has a specialization in special education and a cognate in sociology of education from the University of South Florida. His research interests are investigating interconnected paradigms that impact the educational outcomes of Black students. And he's currently focusing on the role of racism and white supremacy and the academic outcomes of Black boys. So as you can see, we've got some pretty amazing, talented folks here with us today. And I hope that we're all able to continue learning from them beyond, the concept papers and the interviews that we've shared with our community thus far. So welcome to our panelists, and thank you for being here. All right, so I wanted to start our first question because I know that our event is titled Moving from Transgenerational Trauma to Resilience. And so I wanted to kind of bring that into the realm of academic excellence and what that might look like for Black children. So to our panelists, this is the question for all of you. What does academic excellence for Black children mean to you? And specifically, like, how might that differ from their non-Black peers?
I guess I'll start off. I tend to take the Amos Wilson view of academic excellence, and that involves the development of African children's intellect so that they just don't accept society as it is, but to help them foster an idea that whatever intellectual talents they develop, they put them forward to solving issues of African people. I don't think this is much different from what generally other races do, but we tend to take our talents and sell them to the highest bidder in the European community. And that's the major difference in how how the dominant culture sees academic excellence. They tend to want to sort people in a certain pecking order academically. When I was in school, we called it tracking. And generally African-American males and African-American students, period, were tracked in vocational tracks rather than academic tracks. And so that was a way to separate us from put us inside the pecking order of European hierarchy. So again, the way I see the purpose of education for African youth is to solve the problems that confront African people. And that's what I think we should always be geared towards, is solving our problems with our intellectual talents.
And if I can just add to that, for what Dr. Berbings had just mentioned, I too, fall in the line with Amos Wilson's theory about education. But first, always like to pose with an additional question. If we're really about the academic excellence of Black children, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of educating the Black child? Right. So Amos Wilson will argue that the ultimate function of education is to advance the interests of the people and their culture. And then through this advancement, another goal is to protect the interest and ultimately provide a survival and maintain the quality of life of a people, of a community, even of an individual, right? It doesn't matter necessarily what school the child attends, right? Is it an all-white school? Is it a mixed school? Is it white school? What have you, right? But the purpose of the education, again, is to maintain and protect the integrity of the group. So, if that's the case, if Amos Wilson's argument is true, right? I want you to think about this idea of why we go to school, right? And so with that, I need some help. And I know some of the panelists, they can help me out. When we were growing up, there was a phrase I used to always hear, right? And I want, the people who are on the Zoom, throw into the chat, right? Just fill in the blank for this. You go to school so you can get a good. Okay, I see one right there, job. So thank you, thank you, Michael. So if you heard that before, put a Y or a yes into the chat, and I know the panelists, you can nod as well. Well, if that is the purpose, if the purpose of education is to get a good job, then I need to also ask another follow-up question. How does one respond when a job refuses to hire you? So think about it in this context, right? The data has demonstrated that Black women who go on to earn degrees in STEM are underrepresented in those STEM fields, right? And then also think about the next question. How do you respond when a job mistreats you? Right? So think about right now, I don't know if anybody pays attention to the news, but the National Football League is being sued by one of its former coaches that is alleging that the NFL and the owners of the teams have perpetuated racism, white supremacy in terms of not hiring Black coaches specifically, right? So again, if education is getting a job is the purpose of the education, another question you have to ask yourself is, how does one respond when a job does not align with my core values as an individual, right? So these are some queries that I just want to pose because in the theory of human development, when it comes to education, the way that the curriculum is designed now in 2022, it's to teach students and children to just get jobs and to go to work for people who typically do not look like us, nor do those people have our best interest in their heart.
And that wasn't a flaw in the system. That was done by design, very intentionally. It was orchestrated to be a manifestation of the existing social structure that we have. And I so love how Dr. Berbings and Dr. Caldwell have moved this conversation to the place of purpose, right? Because that helps us take the conversations to its fundamental roots, when we start talking about values or axiology, our reality. And what I'm learning is that it's very important to take time and deconstruct this language and these frameworks that are used now so nonchalantly, as if we're operating out of the same reality. So any conversation when we're talking about the education of African descent children and African descent people here and abroad has to first be situated in its appropriate African-centered reality, right? And what we know as we study our history in the Nile Valley civilizations, then in West Africa, and then on these shores, is that the purpose of education was to enable children and all people to be able to be a positive and powerful and productive community force when it was their time. And so that there was a dual foci on character development, as well as the what has been termed the liberal arts, right? And all of that was done in a very community-centric context. So I just wanted to further us in resituating this conversation out of an African-centered reality.
Awesome. So what I'm gathering from each of your responses is that this is complex, and even just how we think about what academic excellence looks like for Black school children today has some historical implications that impact contemporary training and education and how we interact with our the Black children in our lives. I know that Dr. Caldwell mentioned, he shared the quote about, and it seems like a lot of people resonated with it or had maybe even like a different ending to it about, you go to school to get a good education, ultimately that ideally, hopefully leads you to a good job. And I wanted to kind of talk more about some of those transgenerational processes as well, since that's been going to be a big part of our conversation. So along with this conversation about Black excellence academic excellence for Black children, I wanted to, again, bring the transgenerational processes into the conversation. So how has the concept of Black children's academic excellence changed over time and like across generations? And I know that some of the panelists are parents, and so maybe you can speak from your personal experiences and obviously growing up in educational institutions and having to put your children through a similar process now. But talk about what those changes might be over time or what they have been, and maybe even like what you attribute those changes to, like what has caused that? Why are things the way they are now?
I want to, if I could start this one, because it's building off of Dr. Caldwell. When you pose that question or that phrase STEM for us to fill in, you go to school to get what I thought was interesting is that me now, it's always been told and sold that we go to school to get a job. But as I've studied the oral histories and sat with my elders, they would always say, go to school and get your lesson. Go to school and get your learning, get your education. So there's been even a shift in the language in our own communities. Did you notice that, Dr. Caldwell, as you've posed this question over and over again?
Sure, definitely. There has been a change in the phrasing, specifically among Black communities, African communities, regarding the purpose of education. Unfortunately, my assessment is that the school systems in which we all are required by law to send our kids to, again, the values of those systems do not align with the values of our communities, right? So you run into two opposing forces, right? And one has more resources and power than the other, right? And so just to your point, Dr. Acosta, so we see a changing in our narrative, but it doesn't necessarily translate into how our children experience schooling here, at least in this country.
And I like to add, schools, I don't think there's any other institution for those folks who send their children to school that spend more time with our children than public schools. And because we don't control public schools are controlled by the dominant culture, European people. And as Dr. Caldwell said, their values, their morals, their paths and directions are all things that are designed to advance and make sure European culture survives the next however many years, 100,000 years or whatever. And so in terms of the question of how has these things changed, I don't think they've changed very much. I mean, I forget what year it was, but there was if you ever heard of the Mohawk Conference on the Negro Question, which tried to deal with how do we educate Black people, particularly after the recent ending of slavery. I think the conference was held in 1890 or something like that. And they had all these speakers come to discuss how are we going to educate the Negro. And it was the general assessment was we will educate them to serve white people or serve the white community. And I don't think that has changed since. You know, although there are a number of small independent African centered schools and things like that, I think in general, the idea, as Dr. Caldwell put forth, is you go to school to get educated, to get a good job, to provide for your family and whatever, has held. The only thing I think I would add to that is that, you know, I watched my uncles and my elders in my family do just that, have good jobs and provide for their families. But there was inside of that also a different picture. It wasn't just to sell their labor to white people. It was to make life better for their children coming up from the South. My family came up from Selma, you know, got a good enough job to get a house and provide for their children. So it wasn't just the idea of getting a job. It was also an idea of providing some kind of peace for your family as well with these jobs. So although that mantra holds, we have to make some strides in changing it. You know, go to school to get educated, to help your community, to help it move forward, to help it progress, so that we don't continue to be under the heel of European domination.
And I would even add to that when we use that language of go to school to get a job, what I notice is that it's coming from an understanding of the relationship between economics and racism, right? That racial capitalistic perspective. So it's still coming from this place of you go to school to get a job, right? So that we can continue to overcome. Exactly. And so your economic mobility, hopefully, will not only bolster Black dignity, but also Black citizenship. And that came from those terms. I'm using those from Joseph Peniel's work, The Sword and the Shield, when he looks at the radical and revolutionary lives of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And so it's even, you know, saying you go to school to get a job, that is still coming from an Afrocentric place of where we understand these socio-economic realities of what jobs will do for our community by way of individual economic mobility, but also community thrive.
Exactly. And you said it much better than I did, but that's the point again I was trying to make with seeing my uncles and grandparents get these jobs so they could provide things for their families that they didn't have, and especially growing up in a racist apartheid South, and instilling in us that same value of working to help move your family forward and the community forward as well.
So I'm already seeing like a lot of connections between the stuff that we're talking about, because I know we had heard some of you mentioned like how the values and morals of the school system differs from that of our families and communities, and Black families and communities, and how, you know, education is unfortunately tied to economics and preservation and a desire to really grow and move forward and persevere and overcome, like Dr. Acosta said. And I imagine that as we start to think about our littles, like kids who maybe are not able to understand these complex systems that they are, inevitably subjected to, they're participating in it, against their will. They're required to go to school. They're required to be part of these institutions. They don't even have an understanding of that. They're in this system where they may be experiencing discrimination from a white teacher, white peers, and things like that. And again, they're, being taught or having to learn how to play the game per se, how to survive on a day-to-day basis and push forward. And then when they get to high school and they're with their school counselor, career counselor, I'm talking about that next step, they're having to kind of reflect on their experiences and project into the future, like what this could look like and, where might I want to take my life. And we think about across the lifespan, across, the life of Black children and what that, could look like for them in terms of just that pressure to be resilient, the pressure to rise above, all of the factors that are influencing their day-to-day lives. So thank you all for sharing that. I appreciate the conversation about the differences in values and morals and how difficult that can be for children. So I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that, because we've talked about how our values and morals might differ from that of the school system and larger society. How do we continue to instill the values and the morals that are inherent to our heritage and that sort of thing in children, like at home, or even with Black children that we encounter in the school system? What does that look like? How do we counteract those sorts of things? And knowing that this is pretty much like the air that they breathe. There's that quote about racism being air that we breathe, or if we were fish, it'd be the water that we swim in. So how do we counteract that sort of learning and that experience for Black children?
Well, I would argue, first and foremost, you have to be able to accurately and precisely define the problem, right? And I think that throughout the generations, that has been an issue, at least in our communities. Developing the language that precisely defines what is attacking us. Wilson argues that definition brings about reality, and the ability to define is the ability to say what is real and what is not. Right? And so within that context, in the paper that I submitted to CREST deals with racial microaggressions, racial battle fatigue, and surviving white schools. Within this paper, I cite a reframing by Dr. Dorothy Hines from the University of Kansas. She argues that we shouldn't be using the words microaggressions in describing the trauma that is infused and placed towards our children, right? So she argues a reframing of this concept and calling it actually anti-Black aggression, right? And through this anti-Black aggression allows us to give a framework to understand the problems and the attacks that our children face. And furthermore, to answer your question, after we define what is attacking us, it is imperative that we develop some type of code that is generalizable, regardless if you're here in Louisiana, you could be in Florida, California, you could be all the way in the UK, but devising some type of code among our people that addresses properly how to deal with any type of attacks towards our Blackness, right? And then through this code, I also would argue that service providers, I don't care if they're educators, psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, they have to be trained using these Black affirmed, Black-centered, African-centered codes, right? Far too many of us, again, still are, we're trained in a Eurocentric framework. So we just become, Black people regurgitating white theories, right? And those theories may not necessarily be best served for our people. Right. So, to sum this up, have the ability and power to define your reality, right? Develop your own type of language and code, and then train each other in our community with this code so we can better serve our communities.
And I would I would add that, in the second question, that those are some of the indicators of educational excellence as responsive to the disorder that is this social structure, right? So you don't see these principles of educational excellence deviate too much from when we first conceptualized this idea of education and schooling in ancient times, right? So the excellence is always there. It's indigenous to us. But what you do see is it manifests over and over and over again in response to environmental conditions. So as we were forcibly taken to the Americas, and our ancestors woke up to this cosmic disorder, right? Their brilliance, their excellence was still there. But as they were critical studying, right, and figuring out how they were going to do the task of education, because that was never separate from us, they had to devise pedagogies and processes in response to the social structure at the time, right? And this kind of goes to your point, Ashley, about the complexity of it. And I hear you, but I think a little differently. I'm finding it, the more and more I center myself in my right mind, I'm finding it very easy. It's not complex. I'm thinking a lot about Baba Asa Hilliard. He would always say that there is no mystery. There is no mystery to teaching Black children well. It's if we have the will, and if we will allow ourselves, avail ourselves to the natural human way of interacting. And so the indicators of educational excellence that are necessities in the Americas really come down to the point of staying human. And that whole concept of staying human, I'm learning that from another one of my teachers, Dr. Joyce King, like, because in this current social configuration, you know, that is structured according to a hierarchy of human worth, you are socialized and structured right out of your humanity. So educational excellence in an African-centered reality in America is about staying human.
And I'll add to that, in terms of the healing, I think it lies in our culture and our history, and interjecting that into the practice of education and counseling, because the use of history and culture expands treatment and educational agendas to include discussions of social context, history, racism, other group relevant issues of the client or the child as a student. And for example, European culture suggests that when we have issues of trauma, that we handle those autonomously. We handle those things on our own by ourselves. We pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And the African way would suggest that we're all interconnected. And as Bill Withers would say, you know, lean on me, because at some point, I'm going to have to ask you for me to lean on you as well. And researchers like Wade Boykin has shown over and over again that Black children achievement increases when they work in cooperative groups. Sean Utsi, a scholar, has done tons of research on the effects of Afro-cultural coping systems in the form of collective coping, collective emotional debriefing, drawing from African people's interconnected worldview. So we have to interject our culture, and I believe Hakeem Madhubuti said it best, the way to defeat an alien culture is to live your own. So we have to begin to live our own culture and infuse that into education and counseling and any other disciplines that we find ourselves in.
That was beautiful. Live our own. Live it. Be it.
Dr. Caldwell, I saw you unmuted yourself. Did you have something to add?
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with Dr. Berbings' assessment.
Okay. Thank you all for sharing those insights. I think we're digging further and further into this topic, and I wanted to kind of connect it to the work that we do in the CREST program. That we're all about culture-centered, trauma-informed care, and we know that with everything that we're talking about as it relates to education, that there are some transgenerational processes that happen. So children grow up to become adults who have children, and that impacts how they might guide their children through these systems that we talk about, these complex but simple, very simple, non-mysterious systems that we're talking about. And so I wanted to invite each of our panelists to share some interventions that parents on the call, or educators, or even clinicians, if we have mental health professionals on the call, just ways that we can help disrupt this transmission of trauma and really lean into, like we said, staying true to our values while, promoting the healthy development of our children in our community. So what are some interventions that we can use as parents, clinicians, and educators to promote healthy growth in our kids?
I'll start. If you can, I would say one of the best things you can do is homeschool your child, if that's a possibility. For a lot of us, it is not a possibility, but for those who can, homeschooling provides a great path to help shelter and shield, as well as immunize your youth against white supremacy. If you can't do that, then try to find a school that is an African-centered school to see your child to. And outside of that, you have to just be involved in what your child is doing in terms of their education, finding out what's being taught inside the school, scrutinizing the homework that they bring home, and sometimes unteaching what has been taught inside the schools. And I also think for parents, there should be a push to insert a more culturally relevant pedagogy, particularly in public schools, which most of our children, Black children, attend public funded schools. And in having there be a more congruent home school culture, are pushing for those things, and as well as learning preferences that align more with those of African children. And as we see today, the I would say European and Republican parties are ahead of the game, because they're trying to put legislation in that prevent any kind of teaching of history that makes white people look bad. So they're already pushing to prevent these things from happening. So parents just have to really get more involved with students' lives in education.
If I could follow up on that, what Dr. Berbings just illustrated was the use of power, right? The ability to get legislation passed that's banning any inkling of critical race theory being taught within schools, right? I'm a former high school teacher and a former administrator. And so I understand the politics behind curriculum. But I want us to really investigate and interrogate this idea of power, right? Because all the suggestions that Dr. Berbings in terms of interventions just mentioned are spot on. They are needed. One of the most difficult obstacles, however, is this idea of power, right? How do we get control of our schools that our tax dollars go to pay, so we can implement everything that Dr. Berbings, and I'm sure that Dr. Acosta is going to mention in terms of interventions. As of now, we're not. We don't have that power. We send our children to schools that are completely foreign to them. And so, another form of intervention that I suggest for parents is raise hell. Bottom line, raise hell. You see it with parents from other communities. Think back when COVID-19 just hit, right? And we had the mask mandates for schools. And you had parents who don't look like us going to the school board meetings and raising hell about these mandates. Well, you know what? For everything that Dr. Berbings mentioned in terms of intervention, we need to study it, implement it, but most importantly, raise hell to have it in our schools, our public schools, for those who cannot homeschool their children, right? Or send them to an African-centered school. So, there's a political side to this. And in all my classes that I teach here at Xavier, I tell all my students that all education is political. All education is political, and you can't divorce one from the other. So we have to walk away, at least hopefully from here, that we understand that, and I think that would help us be able to move forward in a better direction when it comes to educating our children.
Beautiful. I echo what Dr. Berbings and Dr. Caldwell have shared. I'm gonna come a little different. I'm a mother of 5, and 21 years ago, when my oldest child was born, and the process of ushering them through the public school system, I did all those things, and I'm tired. I got so tired of fighting. And so as we fight like hell and stay on top of things that take so much emotional and cognitive energy, part of the healing I'm bringing is parents. Let's get together. Let's get together. A good friend of mine, Deidre Houchin in Gainesville, Florida, her and some sisters, when COVID first started, they got together and started the Black Parent Support Network. And the motto is, we are better together. That is ancestral. It is ritualistic in terms of reviving our spirits and reminding us of who we are and helping us stay in our right minds. Parents, let's get together. And when we get together, parents, let's go for the hard reset, right? Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, in one of her most recent articles that she put out in the journal Equity and Excellence in Education, the title of it is, I'm here for the hard reset. And I'm here for the hard reset, even within these supposedly social justice oriented spaces, right? We need a hard reset so that we can align even these organizational spaces, even these spaces where we are getting together and trying to struggle and study together. And so that we can be in these spaces in a way that aligns with our own reality, right? And so parents, when we get together, let's commit to first struggle for unity within us. And that's not me. That comes from Amilcar Cabral. Where he notes that those, who are working out of the reality of the land, we have to first struggle for our own unity. And then achieving some level of unity, then we can go out and struggle some more, right? So struggling within ourselves to be and then become a collective, a critical mass that can continue to stay on top of things, raise heck in order to demand what we should have. So parents, let's get together. And when we get together, let's do a hard reset and thinking about how we're going to be together so that it aligns with who we are culturally. So those, as a parent, those have been some of the interventions that have been healing for me. Like I said, I've been parenting Black children for 21 years. Most of those have been with the public school system. I have just freed myself and am now in a place where I can homeschool my children. And then as an educator and a committed community worker, I want us to get together and I want to struggle together. And then I want us to, set ourselves up right as we continue to fight.
Dr. Berbings, did you have something to add? I saw that you unmuted yourself.
No, I'm just in agreement with everything Dr. Costa said.
Okay, thank you for that. So as we can see by the chat, it seems like a lot of the nuggets that you all shared in response to the last question are resonating with our audience, and I appreciate you sharing some like concrete items that we can do to support one another. So I heard ideally that we should be homeschooling our kids or sending them to African-centered schools and institutions. But if that is not possible, I know that Dr. Acosta shared just the emotional toll that can take on a parent. If that's not possible, then tapping into support networks within these predominantly white systems that we send our kids to, and that sort of thing. I heard Dr. Caldwell talk about using power, raising hell, understanding that education is political, despite what they try to extract from it or what they try to, what label they try to put on it, but inherently, when we teach kids, there's a political component to it, and a greater connection to an economic reality. That was something that came up earlier in the conversation about the tie between education and economics in the US. So thank you for those things. I think that as you all responded to that question, you even kind of tapped into the follow-up questions that I had about interventions that you found effective and that sort of thing. So I wanted to, one, remind the audience that you all can share questions in the Q&A feature or via the chat. And if you want to submit a question anonymously, I think you can do that in the Q&A feature, or you can send it directly to the host and the panelists. That way the rest of the audience won't be able to see it, but we really encourage you to interact with us. I know that there have been some comments that have resonated, so if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to share those. But I wanted to talk about what Dr. Acosta mentioned about really self-care. And I will admit in full transparency that I've been kind of struggling with the term self-care, because truly, and this is kind of consistent with what we've been talking about, it really should be community care, right? We talked about how white education systems really focus on the self and the individual. We even see that in mental health training. Most diagnoses are for individuals. We don't talk about systems a whole lot in counseling training. But as we talk about survival and resilience and all those sorts of things, like how do we get to that point? How are we taking care of ourselves and each other to preserve ourselves and our families and communities so that we can persevere, so that we can be resilient and foster the next generation of leaders? And so what does that look like? How do you all take care of yourselves and each other, your families, your community, as parents, as educators? I know Dr. Caldwell mentioned that he's a former administrator. So from that perspective, what does that look like?
I struggle with care just in general, regardless if it's self-care or communal care. This whole notion of, especially this hyper-productive world that we live in, that places all these demands on you, is difficult, at least for me, for care. I don't have any children, so shout out to Dr. Costa. She has 5 beautiful babies. Hopefully I can match that one day, but I don't have any kids myself personally. But in terms of just, I would take it from a medical lens if I can. If you look at any of the literature, you see that there exist disparities in based upon race in medical care, right? We know that. And if we disaggregate the data and we look at what Black women experience, they have a certain set of disparities, and then Black men have their own certain set. But in terms of care, all my doctors are Black. My dentist is Black. My eye doctor is Black. And I do that purposefully because even though you can't completely eliminate any bias or a prejudice or anti-Blackness within the medical field, it is my responsibility to reduce those occurrences from happening, right? So I would, kind of follow up on what Dr. Berbings stated earlier about trying to identify a school that can precisely meet the needs of the Black children. We have to be very deliberate on where we send our kids to school, right? And not even our own personal children, but our kids down the street, have the conversation with their moms or their dads, because they may not know. There is one thing I can tell you this from being a former administrator. There is a faith and a belief that unfortunately we place into the public school system, right? And we have to disrupt that faith and belief into the system, right? When I was an administrator, I used to tell the Black parents, I'd close the door and say, look, the school doesn't want your child here. And you should see the look on their face, right? Because again, it disrupts their belief, it disrupts their faith, their understanding of what we think schools are supposed to be, this place where we uplift and affirm children. But unfortunately, the schools in this country, which are embedded and rooted in, anti-Blackness and racism and white supremacy, they aren't designed for our children. So we have to protect them so they can ultimately survive these systems while they move forward. So being explicit and deliberate in your actions, at least in my estimation, is a form of self-care. And I'm sure we'll have other suggestions on that as well.
All right, I'll go next. I grew up poor, so you had to be real. You had to be real inventive about a lot of things. Self-care was not one of those things you had to be inventive about. And I grew up in a community and a family that was very tight, very close. So all of my neighbors, my family, and I grew up in a time where schools were still segregated, not by law, but that's just how it was. My school was 90% Black in terms of the teachers, 100% Black in terms of the students. So, and those teachers lived in my neighborhood. So I was supported a lot. And that is something that we have to bring back, is the support that we get from our neighbors, from our community, from church. And we've been kind of scared off by the idea of allowing someone to care for our children for, good reasons, and, that we see. We don't want people molesting our children, anything like that. But we also have to still find a way to build community. But as I got older, in terms of self-care, I didn't do that a lot. But there were things that I did do. I worked for the school system I taught, and we got three off days a year in terms of that we could take. I always took them. We had sick leave. I would take that too when I got tired of being at school. When I was so frustrated with working, I would just take a day off. It's, I'm not coming in today. So that is a form of self-care, and you have to be inventive about how you take care of yourself, especially when you don't have a lot of resources, when you have to go to work every day. You got to get real creative about how you take care of yourself. Other ways I would take care of myself, there were times I would come home and I would just not turn the TV on, have the lights off, and I would just sit. And you might call it meditation. I don't think I was meditating, but I would just sit to get some quiet. I would do other things. I would, of course, go out with friends, talk to friends, lean on other people when I had problems or things were real stressful. But those are kind of things I did to take care of myself at stressful times. But growing up, I had a big support system. And even today, my support system is not as big as it was, but there is real value in developing strong, caring relationships with people you can trust, people you love and care about, because they can add years to your life. So developing strong support systems is important. And that's what I try to do now.
I'll add just a bit to that. Really just to kind of work through what Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Berbings said, just pull on some of the things that they talked about that I do as well. And so when Dr. Caldwell was talking about just when he would close the door and tell his Black parents, like it TI is, what that reminds me of is the importance of racial realism. And that's a concept from Derek Bell, and how he talks about the importance of racial realism. And that's important for us walking our walk, right? To move away from the illusion, to operate out of the reality of the land, right? So caring for this me is about keeping my feet planted in the reality of who I am and where I am, right? In that reality, it helps me stay in my mind. And one of the things that Dr. West Olatunji put in the chat, hashtag, we need to control our own schools. And that is a function of power, right? Self-determination, which is what we've always been striving for because it's a natural state, right? To be self-determining. And so the more that I can orient my life around autonomy, and we know the one that's going to come at us the hardest in these United States of America is economic. That's the first place that you will be attacked, especially if you are a Black person working in a professional space. If you come from humble beginnings, you know, you're achieving that type of economic mobility can be somewhat tenuous, right? And so the first, as I've looked historically, the first seat of backlash and resistance is economic. And so the more I can create spaces of autonomy as a flex of my control or power to be self-determining, has been really a form of care, because it relieves the emotional and cognitive stressors that used to keep me concerned about what would happen if I stand up for Black people, if I talk about Black stuff all the time. It allowed me to further and further move into this space of unbotheredness. So that has been helpful. And central to that was my reading of Emancipation Betrayed by Paul Ortiz. And it talks about the Ocoee massacre. But more than that, it talks about Black organizing for citizenship and voting rights. And one of the sections he wrote was called An Army of Self-Help, armed self-help. And so our ancestors, Black folks in Florida, they knew they were gonna be met with resistance to fighting for their voting rights. But they did it anyway, but they were prepared. When they would send someone to go and vote, they knew what was coming. And so they would come around at night and sit on the front porch in rocking chairs with their pistols, protecting, waiting to defend each other, right? And to maintain some sense of control over how they fought for equality. So that was really helpful there. And last, just a sense of connectedness. I'm learning that trauma fragments, it disconnects you. So the more that I can connect to things and people and places and spaces that bring me joy, that I love, are essential to this idea of care. And that's not a the thing done in solitude for me. That's done very much in relationship. All of these things are really done in relationship with other folks.
Absolutely. I appreciate you all sharing what self and community care it looks like for you within these systems. I hope that the folks who are listening were able to take something away that resonated with them, or maybe something that feels a little bit uncomfortable that you might want to give a try based on what we've learned from our panelists thus far. So we did get a question in the Q&A. I know that Dr. Acosta, earlier you were talking about how in predominantly white schools that you've had your children in, you have been intentional about connecting with other Black parents and creating and holding those spaces with those other Black parents. And you also mentioned a hard reset, and you talked about it a little bit, but I think that maybe the audience wants to learn more about what that hard reset looks like. And so I maybe you kind of touch on that in the self and community care response. So maybe those things are connected. I didn't want to make that assumption. So talk to us about what that looks like. And if Dr. Berbings or Dr. Caldwell, if anything that Dr. Acosta is saying is resonating with you, or you have experience with as well, maybe under a different name or something like that, feel free to share that as well. So what is the hard reset that you speak about, Dr. Acosta?
Yeah, so really quickly, it underscores the importance of getting down to the core, the crisis of knowledge and ideology and hegemony that we're dealing with. And one of the manifestations that I see so much is that we have these social justice and equity spaces and reform agendas around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're still operating in a Eurocratic hegemonic frame. And we are in these spaces as people of African descent trying to be with each other, and we can't, because sometimes we unconsciously bring in those Eurocentric practices that we have been socialized into in the space of justice work, but we're expecting emancipatory outcomes. Ain't gonna happen. And so what I found is that it's really important, before we can talk about doing, we gotta be. And we gotta get that being right, and we gotta reset, decolonize, sever, reject that Eurocentric way of being. And then the Eurocentric way of being in a social justice equity group or whatever. And that hard reset is like every time we get together, we got a hard reset and reclaim this space as one that is for, about, and threaded through and with the knowledge and wisdom of Black folks. And it's a hard reset, because you are, Fanon talks about this type of violence, disruptive violence, and how colonialism is a violent, ideologically violent process. And so the decolonial measures have to be just as violent. But he wasn't talking about that physical violence stuff. He was underscoring the psychological and cognitive nature of colonial violence at its core of our personhood. And so understanding that reality, that means every time we get together, we have to come in knowing that, okay, all of us have been swimming in Eurocentric white supremacy culture, especially if we're professionals working in these white spaces. We've been swimming in it. So the first thing we do before we open our mouths to do anything else, let's reset, let's hard reset and claim this space and erect some principles and processes to continuously claim this space, plant the flag of Black freedom and emancipation in our work. Thoughts?
Well, I would just definitely agree with that in terms of when I look at my own evolution as you said, Fanon spoke about it being violent. It was violent. I mean, I had to fight against all those things I was taught and understood to be true growing up and reclaiming, my African past, my African background. And that was challenging because for me, and I'm putting it in, I guess, religious terms. I grew up in the Christian church, and leaving that was scary. It was terrifying because I didn't want to go to hell. I didn't want to do this or do that. So it was a violent confrontation with myself in terms of evolving and changing. But I certainly believe I'm the better for it. And it doesn't mean I have an issue with Christianity or any of the things that I sort of left behind. I understand what value they bring, but I also understand what value my culture brings. And I'm very connected with that. So I definitely agree with you that, that change can be a huge struggle, but I believe it's a necessary one that we all should take on.
Thank you for that. So I hope that cleared up the inquiry about what that hard reset could look like, and what it might entail. I did want to, I'm looking at the time, and I wanted to invite our other GA, Jacqueline, to share the other question that we got in the chat with the panelists.
Hello, everybody. That was a very engaging conversation, very engaging, a lot of great information. Dr. Casa, you talked about the Ocoee massacre, and it reminded me of some years ago when I was doing theater, and I had a person that created a play around July Perry and that in Ocoee massacre. And you said that, I got like a in my head about that. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, thank you. This question will be for Dr. Acosta. I'm sorry, Dr. Caldwell. So the question is, how can we intentionally support Black providers, doctors, dentists, etc., when the service we receive is subpar?
Find another Black doctor. I mean, I don't accept the idea that all Black doctors provide subpar service. I reject that wholeheartedly. And just full disclosure, my wife is a physician. She's on the call right now. So what's up, baby? Hey. She has a list of service providers who are Black, who are phenomenal. And so again, I would say this, and let's just be upfront. When it comes to supporting Black businesses and companies, we're quick to have a strong scrutiny towards our own people, right? But when non-Black businesses and companies, give us their behinds to kiss, we want to beg and march and assimilate into their structure, right? We'll knock down the door just so we can sit down at Starbucks to get some coffee without being harassed, right? So again, if you have encountered subpar services from a Black doctor, dentist, what have you, find another one. That was just that one individual, and we can't hold the entire group to the misdeeds of one person.
Thank you for that. Anybody else want to? Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Ms. Jacqueline. Ebony put it in the post. Is she willing to share that list? I'm gonna drop my email address. Email me, and I'll get it to y'all.
Well, I certainly agree with that. If there's a Black business that hasn't treated you right, then find another one or give them a second chance. They might have just had a bad day. Who knows? I think Black folks deserve more than one shot at your business. So give them another shot and see if it's better the next time. But don't be too quick to push them away and then paint the rest of Black businesses with a broad brush. That's just how Black people do you, and it is not. And so that's my take on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I agree. But I would also like to just use the moment to ask some reflective questions. Is that me? Like, what is the story that we're telling ourselves to say that every single Black business that we run, that we come into contact with, has got to be exceptional?
Right.
Like, what are the myths? Where is that coming from? How did we learn that? What body of whose truth is that emerging from? And start that journey there with looking for different providers. Like,
yeah, I want to add to that. So I'm going to jump into the panel discussion because I provided a written response, and my response was more questions. And they were similar to what you all are saying. So one is the issue of, we always need to have a historical context. We need to look with a historical lens. One of the things that's common within Eurocentrism is a present orientation of everything is now, like whatever's going on now, it's so important now. And the history of it all is not really a part of it. So it's really important for us to ask, when did we morph into this discourse? So that you see it within a larger context and ask more questions. I think if there's anything that I've taken away from today, and the presenters, is that they have all asked more questions. And I thought therapists were good at that, at, asking a question when you ask a question. But they're doing that, but that's good because that leads us to critical thinking. So we're not here to spoon feed you about anything. We're here to just offer you information, evidence from the research, and let you come to conclusions on your own. But they are saying, free your mind, that we have thought European thoughts for so long, we don't even know which thoughts are our own. It's like being lost in a cloud or a forest or something with no way out, and being wandering around in the wilderness, and you finally get out and you were like, what was I doing now? Like,
yes.
Where was I? And that's where we are. We've been thinking these thoughts for so long that we don't even know what we were thinking before. So it's going to take a while, right, to deconstruct, to decolonize, and to figure that thing out. So it's difficult. We can't trust our first thought. We have to take a moment and ask ourselves, is that my thought? Or is that a thought that's been given to me? And so I need to figure that thing out and learn and relearn how to be human again. The human experiences Dr. Asa Hilliard taught me, the late Dr. Asa Hilliard, that this reality, right, is something that we have to daily try to figure this thing out, to deconstruct that colonial thinking. And we don't really know to what extent it has invaded our minds. And so when we think about being human, as we heard Dr. Acosta talk about, our humanity is within a cultural context. So there isn't some kind of blank slate of being human and people ask, well, why do I need to recapture my cultural self, right? It's because we can't buy this idea that there's some blank slate human identity. Mm-hmm. And so that's been passed to us, but underneath that is the little sneaky thing is, no, it's a European human identity. And they're telling you that it's the blank, but it's not. So our ability to stand on 2 feet on this planet as human beings is necessitated, right, by our need to be African. So to be African is to be human for Black people. To be human is not to be European for Black people. It is to be African as Black people. And that is how we reach our humanity. And with our humanity comes what you see here today: confidence, excellence, right? All of these things occur. So when we're thinking about Black children, that is why the research over decades keeps saying, this is the research now, it's not my opinion, this is the research. Over and over, different scholars, new generations of scholars, they keep looking at it and they see this strong correlation between a Black identity and academic excellence. Done, drop the mic, that's it.
Yep.
So if we want our children to do well, we have them to think for themselves and stay in their African minds, as Amos Wilson taught us. Stay in your right African mind. And that is what we heard today. So I would say, you know, stay critical, look over a long lens over history to get a sense of what's going on. So my question is, when did we stop seeing Black professionals and Black businesses as the preferred? When and why? Whose interest does that serve, and so on? And then also questions around, well, what is par? What are we looking for? You know, so I know there's issues. I'm not saying, I mean, everybody has something different, but I would say, you know, when you look at, there's a lot of places that have bells and whistles. But what kind of service are they giving you? What do they know about Black health? You know, which is what we're saying in terms of education, Black pedagogy. But we're saying in terms of mental health. What do we know in terms of Black mental health? And are the goals of Black mental health the same as they are from a European perspective? So when I'm trying to help people to get well, where am I taking them? You know, same thing with education. Where are we taking them? Whose interests are they serving? And the same thing with our physicians and our veterinarians and our dentists. It's like, are they doing things that are consistent with our value system when they're making recommendations and making prognoses about what's going on? Is it within our context? So those are a lot of questions. I'm not, you know, suggesting that's not a good question. It is. It is one that needs to be discussed. And that's what this is, a forum where we can come together and ask these questions and talk about them and think about things differently. So I just wanted to add that.
Amen. Yes.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, Dr. West. So I'm also looking at the time. So I want to give our panelists the opportunity to share any final thoughts that they might have with our audience. So I know that there are lots of gems to take away, but if you wanted them to take away one last thing, what might that be? And we'll hear from each of our panelists before we wrap up here.
I'll share. And again, I'm gonna come through for the Black parents in the space. That's just where my head is. Homeschooling my children has just been a further transformative experience for me. So I'm gonna drop this for the Black parents, and I've said this a few times before. When you're in spaces in Eurocentric educational spaces, be okay being that parent, right? That is a mode of demonstrating our care, concern, and regard for our children. That is our mechanism for trying to protect our children. That demonstrates our brilliance and our understanding of reality, that the schooling institutions that our children are in are not about serving us well. So be okay being that parent. I've heard a lot of parents talk to me about, oh, well, I was going to do that, but I didn't want them to think this, and I didn't want to be that parent. And I tell them really quick, I am that parent. Joseph, Jocelyn, Julian, Joshua, and Jewel Avery are depending on me to be that parent, and I won't let them down. And I know you don't want to either. So be okay. Wear it as a badge of honor. Be okay being that parent.
I'll give some last words. There's a lot said here. There's a lot to learn and go over. And I believe this is being recorded, so folks may have an opportunity to see it again or see it from the beginning if they missed some things. But what I would like to share is, I guess I want to encourage folks to get deeper within their culture, understanding African culture for African people, and what African culture can provide as a way of giving us a different standard to judge European culture by. And I think that's one of the biggest advantages of understanding African culture. It gives us a different lens at looking at the world and understanding what is right and what is wrong. And I especially see that in terms of the way folks do business. Is it right to evict people in a pandemic? I mean, what do European values say about that versus African values? Is it right to do things like that? And I think for African people, of course, being human is the first edict in our ethos, being human to each other, and you don't do things like that. So I want people to really understand the values inside of African culture, and not only understand them, but practice those values. And if we practice those values with one another, we can develop stronger, responsible, trusting communities and relationships. And so that we won't question a Black business and say, it's this or that because I didn't get good service today. We be more forgiving and more balanced in our reactions with them if we follow and practice African cultural norms. So I want to leave people with that, is get deeper within African culture and practice the best of African culture.
And I would just close with this. Being that it is February and it's a Black History Month, we do make sure that we honor the ancestors and call the name of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who was the founder of Negro History Week, which morphed into what is considered Black History Month now. And in preparation for this discussion, I went back to his seminal book, The Miseducation of the Negro, right? And I was attempting to apply his theory towards this idea of transgenerational trauma and moving into this form of resiliency. And through the examination of his book and his work, it kept, resonated with me that our children are still being purposefully miseducated. Purposefully. And through this purposeful miseducation, they're not equipped with the tools to address the transgenerational trauma or any other aspect of racism, white supremacy that impacts their lives. So through that, we have to be extremely clear that racism, white supremacy is the author of confusion. Right? And this confusion manifests itself in education. It manifests itself on how we perceive one another, be it through interactions in business, relationships, what have you. And so moving forward, we're going to have to develop ways in which that we can address this internalized anti-Blackness that has been given to us by being captors in this racist white supremacist system that impacts us this most. But I will close with this. It is important to affirm your Blackness, as Dr. Olatunji mentioned earlier. And also just, let's love each other a little bit more. We are in February. We do have Valentine's Day coming up next week. So love each other, love your Blackness, and hopefully we'll be able to, witness and actualize where we want to go as a people in the community.
Awesome. Thank you all for those final thoughts. So we've got Be That Parent from Dr. Acosta, not to be afraid of how we're perceived when we defend and go to bat for our children. Dr. Berbings talked to us about learning our culture and knowing more about our history. And then Dr. Caldwell suggested that we honor our ancestors and those who came before us and did all this important work that led us to this point, and addressing our internalized anti-Blackness that we might have as a result of living in a racist society and world, and to love each other. It's a month of love and Black History Month, so I'm loving on each other in all our Blackness. So thank you for that. I wanted to turn the mic back to Dr. Wes Olatunji to talk about our upcoming event.
Yeah, just a reminder to those of you who are interested, and please let everyone else know, the next webinar in March 15th, is going to be called Dispelling the Myth of the Sassy Black Girl, Promoting Healthy Identity Development in Black School Girls. For those of you who might remember when we did the webinar on suicide and Black youth, one of the things that we were alarmed by were the rising rates of suicide among Black girls in particular. I think it was 2 or 3 times that of their peers. So we thought we'd focus on them. So we hope to see you next month. Thank you so much for coming. We enjoyed you. Please contact us if you need to. We'll be sending a follow-up email to you with links and additional pieces of information. So we look forward to seeing you, and have a great day. Have a great Valentine's. We love you. Until next time, thank you.